Hello, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Space from Home podcast. My name is Daniel Verscharen, and I'm a lecturer in space plasma physics at the University College London's Mullard Space Science Laboratory. In this podcast, I tell you a little bit about the work of space scientists and engineers during the time of the COVID-19 situation. 2 weeks ago, a comet reached its closest distance from the Sun. The name of this comet is C2019Y4, or Atlas for short. At that time, the comet was about a quarter of the distance from the Sun compared to the Earth's distance from the Sun. This by itself is not a very special thing because it happens fairly often. The really interesting thing is that our Solar Orbiter spacecraft potentially crossed the tails of this comet at about the same time. Let's take one step back. What are comets? Comets are small bodies in our solar system that consist mostly of ice, dust, and some rocks. Most of the comets sit quietly in the outer parts of our solar system. We don't really know how many comets are out there, probably many billions, but once in a while, a comet makes its way into the inner solar system. As the comet approaches the Sun, the comet starts to become active. This means that the ice at the surface of the comet nucleus begins to evaporate and forms a cloud of gas around the nucleus. In this process, the evaporating gas also takes some of the dust with it. This cloud around the comet is called the coma. As you can imagine, this process is stronger when the comet gets closer to the Sun. The sunlight shines on the coma, and it begins to look like a fluffy cloud in pictures taken with telescopes, like in this one from the Hubble Space Telescope. The Sun's harsh UV light can even strip the electrons off some of the gas particles in the coma and ionizes them. The most famous part of a comet is certainly its tail. To be fair, I should mention that there are often two tails actually, but what are these tails? The coma, this fluffy cloud of gas and dust around the comet's nucleus, experiences the solar wind. You remember from the previous podcasts that the solar wind is that continuous stream of particles that leave the Sun and flow away radially through the space between the planets. When the solar wind hits the coma, it kind of pushes the material away. Since the solar wind flows usually in a straight line away from the Sun, this force against the coma material pushes the coma in the anti-sunward direction. This is how the tails form. However, we have different types of material in the coma, remember? There is gas and dust. Since the dust is a bit heavier than the ionized gas particles, it stays behind a little bit as the comet moves in its orbit. That's why the gas tail, we also call it the ion tail, is usually straight, while the dust tail is a bit bent. These tails can be really long. Sometimes they are as big as the distance of the Earth from the Sun. That's amazing considering that the comet nucleus itself is usually just a few kilometers or up to tens of kilometers big. With telescopes here on Earth, we can take stunning pictures of comets, like this one from Comet Hale-Bopp from 1997. Here you can clearly see the two types of tails, the gas tail in blue on the left and the dust tail in white on the right. We have already visited a comet with a spacecraft before. ESA's Rosetta spacecraft actually went into the orbit of Comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko in 2014, and it sent back detailed images of the comet's nucleus as well as detailed measurements of the coma around which the spacecraft orbited. Rosetta even had a small lander attached to the main spacecraft. This so-called Philae module landed on the comet's surface for further studies. Other spacecraft have flown coincidentally through the tails of comets before, so that we have some other measurements of comet tails. Earlier this year, 3 colleagues of mine from my space lab, Geraint Jones, Kazim Afgan, and Oliver Price, have predicted that Solar Orbiter would cross the ion tail of Comet Atlas around the 31st of May and the dust tail at the 6th of June of this year. They have calculated carefully the positions of the comet and of the solar orbiter spacecraft. Based on modeling of the shapes and directions of the tails, they were able to make quite a detailed prediction for the solar orbiter team. What would you expect to see when you cross a comet tail with a spacecraft? For once, Solar Orbiter's SWA instrument would be able to detect the pickup ions. These are particles from the comet's coma, for example, hydrogen or oxygen ions, that are taken with the solar wind. Here you see measurements from an earlier comet tail crossing observed by the Ulysses spacecraft in 2007. The pickup ions appear as heavier and faster particles in our measurements. As these particles load the solar wind itself would also get a bit slower. In addition, the measurements of the solar wind before and after the comet tail would tell you how fast and how dense the solar wind was when it hit the comet, and that can help us a better understanding of its pushing against the coma. Another interesting feature should be visible in the magnetic field measurements. When the solar wind passes the comet, the magnetic field in the solar wind changes its direction and forms an elongated structure with rotations in the field direction behind the comet. We call this process magnetic field line draping because of the shape of the field lines. You can see the shape of the magnetic field lines behind the comet in this nice illustration. As you can imagine, while you fly through such a structure, your magnetometer would measure how the direction of the magnetic field changes with time according to this picture. When the spacecraft flies through the dust tail, you would be able to detect the actual dust particles from the comet tail. Solar Orbiter doesn't have a dedicated instrument for the detection of dust on board. However, there is a trick to measure dust. Keep in mind that the dust particles are quite fast when they come to the spacecraft. If such a fast dust particle hits the spacecraft at any point, this impact will kick out some charged particles from the spacecraft. These are electrons and ions. Depending on the environment of the spacecraft and how the spacecraft itself is charged, this leads to a change in the electric potential of the spacecraft. With our electric field antennas, we can measure this very quick change in the electric potential. On Solar Orbiter, the RPW instrument includes electric field antennas, mostly for the purpose of measuring waves in the solar wind. However, when a dust particle hits the spacecraft, RPW would detect a strong spike in the electric field. Based on the shape of these spikes and how often they occur, we can then analyze the properties of the dust. Although the Solar Orbiter spacecraft is still not fully ready for science operation, remember it just launched in February, the mission team decided to turn the instruments on as much as possible during the time of the predicted comet tail crossing. As you can imagine, the analysis of data will take quite some time because we have to put all the different instruments together. SWA for the solar wind measurement, the measurement of the cometary ions, MAG, the magnetometer for the finding of the draping in the magnetic field, and RPW for the analysis of dust impacts. It's probably also not surprising that we were all a bit nervous about that. A further complication in this observation was that Comet Atlas apparently broke into a few pieces at the end of March, which you can see nicely in these pictures taken with the Hubble Space Telescope. But now we are quite happy that we have data to analyze and to check what we can find out about this comet. Comets are a fascinating group of objects to study in general. We now believe that comets have played a very important role at the early stage of our solar system. They are some of the oldest objects in the solar system, and comets most likely contributed a lot to the formation of Earth and the Earth's atmosphere. Therefore, observing and measuring comets will actually help us to understand the history of our own planet much better. In addition, the comet measurements with Solar Orbiter are a beautiful example of all the extra science that you can do with a spacecraft mission, even though it is originally dedicated for something very different. Solar Orbiter is primarily a mission to study the Sun and solar wind. However, we will hopefully see many other comet measurements during the duration of this mission. If you like this short look into space from home, please like and share this video, and then hopefully I'll see you around next time. Until then, take care and stay safe. Goodbye.